I think I want to start by just saying that we're really grateful for the opportunity of coming here to present and being part of the conference. Really excited to hearing everybody else's work and learning from you guys. We were going to start by doing a little bit of an introductions of who we are, so you get a little sense of where we come from, and then we're going to jump into our project. So, did you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
Start.
Yeah.
I think we practiced multiple times,
Yeah.
and we've done the presentation multiple times, and we still get nervous every time. I think it's typically normal. Again, Jordan had introduced me. My name is Beckie. I'm actually in the 4th year of the program up at the Yukon College, and I currently do part-time. I've been doing my degree pretty much the whole time part-time while working full-time as a single mom. I currently work in a union now, but my past work was in 10 years in the field, was history of doing coordinating outreach program to doing some working at a treatment center, as well as working doing education around HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Bianca, and I was born in Quebec, but I moved to the Yukon when I was 5, so I grew up there. I work in harm reduction, so the last presentation was pretty interesting to me. I'm like 2/3 of the way through my degree, and a little bit about myself. I'm passionate about social justice, dog mushing, and traveling. And I gotta say, initially when we looked at the lineup, was like, I'm so intimidated by all the presentation, looks so interesting, and ours seems so dry because it's about regulation. But then I remembered everything that I've learned through this project, because it's not something I would have naturally been drawn to look into. But the fact that I looked into it really helped to show me how important it is to look at the governing structures of the profession and how different theories really inform it, because it really informs the work on the ground. So I think that for me, in terms of like activism in my life and in my personal life and my professional life, I think it's really important to get really comfortable with macro level change and looking into more policy things. Yeah, so I hope you guys will get some inspiration as well from this. Okay, so maybe we can shift now our focus to our research and community service learning opportunity. What we hope to do today is to show you the why and the how we worked on informing social work regulation in the North through the use of an Indigenous ideological framework. So the first thing we want to do is take you through the steps of our project. So as Jordan mentioned, this all started through a policy class. So me and Beckie were in the same class, and we were assigned to work together, which is great. Really lucky to have Beckie as a partner. And our assigned community partner was the Association of Social Workers of Northern Canada. And we did our research around the issue of the lack of regulation that exists in the Yukon. So the Yukon and Nunavut are the 2 territories that don't regulate the social work profession. So that means that you don't have to have a degree to work in social work. So yeah, we researched a lot around this issue and the pros and cons of how different people have approached regulation throughout the country. And then we looked at regulation through an Indigenous lens, like a policy lens. We presented the policy brief to our organization, and it got really good results. And so we got to scale up the project, and we got to do a jurisdictional scan, and we did a research project basically. Annotated bibliography, literature review, and we're doing a final report that we're going to present to the association. Okay, so now Beckie's going to talk to you a little bit about the why of our project, and most precisely like why it was important for us to look at applying an Indigenous lens to policy.
So, I mean, she posed a really good question. Why are we using an Indigenous lens? And so if I can point out to you, right there, 25% of our population in the Yukon just in 2016 were Indigenous. That speaks to a large population that should have a huge involvement in about any process that we even have a thought about being able to move through. It's quite unique in the sense that there's actually 14 different Yukon First Nations. That includes language, culture, as well as protocols. just in talking with Bianca a little bit more last night, we talk about the colonization also in the Yukon, talking about how the Alaska Highway impacted the Indigenous, how the 60 scoop, we're talking residential schools as well. Just the impact that has been made in the as well is so important to be able to recognize. Also, of those 14, 11 of them actually are currently self-governing. I'm going to speak a little bit further to that in the further slides, but basically it gives complete authority to draw down any legislation. The other layer with that in terms of our role as upcoming social workers is honoring both the calls of action from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and also looking at the context, how unique that the Yukon is. So I thought I'm a big person about image. I believe in image as well as just as much as reading. So if you look here, this is actually in Ottawa at the Parliament building. So this was back in the early 70s when there was a group from the Yukon that went to Ottawa to speak about building a document that enabled them to have some rights around what was happening to them in the north.
Yeah, it's a group of Yukon First Nations. It was called the Yukon Native Brotherhood, and they went to advocate for self-governance.
So when we talk about self-governance, we wonder, there's a difference up in the Yukon. There was actually no treaties, unlike a lot of places across Canada. And so this was actually a benefit for the Yukon in the sense that we had room to be able to look at negotiating for self-governance. So I thought from there was a document that was created, an advocacy document, and I'd like to play a little clip. And this is because a lot of the individuals that are here, some that I know, that can speak to it, what that document actually meant to them. And I'd like to say that often we want them to be able to have their own voice versus us speaking for them.
Together Today for Children Tomorrow is a cornerstone document of Yukon history. It reflects the frustration Aboriginal people had in the 1960s, early 1970s. Just as importantly, it's a statement of where we wanted to go. It was a clear statement that we wanted to be involved in the economy, that we wanted to have healthy communities, that we wanted our kids to be educated, and that we had communities full of hope. So for me, that document, that's what it is.
Our elders of the day were very concerned about our future, my future, and here I am today saying the same words that they do, sitting at those implementation tables, and the message is still the same. We're here for our children of tomorrow.
So very much so, Together Today is a foundational document that will be in existence and relevant for 100 years from now. And if you've read the document, it's very simple. It could be read by a grade 4, student that could totally understand and comprehend what was the vision then and how it relates to now.
It was a format for people's voices, really. People coming together and saying, yes, we want more for our future, we want more for our children. And it allowed people to speak with that unified voice and to really look to the future and say, yes, we want to change it, and this is how we want to change it.
I often refer to it as a manifesto. It was the initial position of Yukon First Nations people, and it includes so much ideas and so much vision, and aspiration and dreams. It's very honest, it describes a period of time which I think is important for us to remember.
It's our way of life. I think the concept behind that was whatever we do today is always for the children's of tomorrow and the children's of tomorrow and tomorrow. It's history. It's us making history.
So, kind of mentioned in the video, it talks about how this Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow document was created. As a result of that, the government accepted to start negotiations with the Yukon First Nations about land. And then from there, the umbrella final agreement was drafted up in around 1993. I encourage you, and it's fairly small at the bottom, but if you have a paper or a pen, I encourage you to go look up mappingtheway.ca. It is talks about the history of the Yukon First Nations to self-governing. It's just a wealth of information and knowledge and a lot more videos.
Okay, and I don't know, the reason we're really showing this, it's really important in the Yukon, if you're thinking about regulation, to really think about how we could do it in a way that respects the people whose land we're on. So what we did in order to kind of concretely ground ourselves and familiarize ourselves with how an Indigenous lens could actually be used in policy, we used a concrete existing policy. It was Ontario's professional misconduct policy. And then we found an Indigenous policy framework, which is Morissette's Indigenous Ideological Framework for Policy Analysis, which we will talk a bit more about later, and we can talk a bit more over the lunch with some people if you're interested. But yeah, so we contrasted that policy to this one. So our analysis method consisted of reviewing each of the 36 policy guidelines and then contrasting them against Morissette's framework to find common ground and differences. And then we discussed and compiled complementary and contradictory aspects, like how it fit and how it didn't. And then we brainstormed possible policy modifications and policy alternatives. And we looked at and we thought about the potential implications some of the ideas we had would have on Yukon First Nations and self-governance. So Morissette's ideological framework has 8 main tenets, and all of them are right here. I don't know why we can't see the last 2. But I'm not going to go through in depth, but basically, some of the recurring themes were collectivity, spirituality, harmony with nature, and the essential goodness of people was highlighted. For example, in the fundamental values tenet, they were talking about how important it is to be collective, that responsibilities to others and the community should be based on need, differences should be respected, and people should have the freedom from exploitation. So a lot of the things aligned with some of the policy framework, because regulation is about making sure that people aren't exploited and trying to protect them. At the same time, regulatory policies are sometimes very formal and institutional and don't necessarily align with some of the more collective pieces.
So kind of through the project, and I might add that fairly early into the project, we started to have some very clear insights and beliefs about where our project was going or where we would like to see it going in the future. One other thing was the biggest highlight was assuming how people want to be protected is dangerous. We believe that we needed to have a voice, not just as upcoming social workers, but also the clients that we serve, that being the First Nations that might be involved, partnering agencies. We just felt that there needed to be more of a voice. The second thing is that we really wanted what we say is meaningful. So not just engagement, but meaningful engagement. We want people that feel like they're actually, what they're saying is meaningful. They have involvement. They feel like they're participating in a way that is valued. The other one is believing that when we're talking a little bit, Bianca spoke about some of those beliefs under Morissette's values is important as making sure that the community understands and is involved, which actually builds leading to a holistic community healing. So it's part of a bigger process. And we also believed that most involved, everyone is affected from this. So there was actually 2 possible policy recommendations that we explored in the Yukon. That we would keep a social service worker diploma. The reason for that, it allows more people to be in the profession as helpers. Also, it might lessen the stigma that currently exists around the profession for Yukon First Nations people. And the biggest part was the leaving room for grandfathering, especially for individuals that were actually already in the field in their own communities doing the work.
So another recommendation that we sort of thought of when we were contemplating how that policy lens could fit is the creation of an Indigenous legislative governing body. So we thought if ever the Yukon decided to be regulated, maybe there could be like an Indigenous body that would be part of that would work in conjunction with the territorial body, and that would maybe allow First Nations to have their own requirements and really say, if social workers are regulated, this is what we want them to do, this is how we want them to behave. We could have members from each of the Yukon First Nations be present, and that would maybe allow for more control over a profession that has harmed and continues to control significant aspects of Indigenous people's lives. We think that the benefits of an option like that would be increased trust and public protection, since Yukon First Nations could report directly to the representative. Because when you think, oh, I have a regulatory body, people are just, if they've been harmed by social workers, they can file a complaint. Like, a lot of people don't feel very comfortable that is not an avenue that they might naturally take. When we looked into NWT, I was speaking to an informant, and they were like, yeah, we've gotten like one complaint over the next year. It's great. And I'm like, one complaint to me doesn't sound like a great thing. It means that people aren't necessarily feeling they can seek help, or when they feel that they've been harmed. So it also allows for Yukon First Nations to include values they believe are important prerequisites to regulation of the profession. So a lot of the Morissette's lens was talking about spiritual values, which I think is something that we have a really hard time implementing when we think about social work. It's something that we don't really know sometimes how to bring in, and I think that would be a way to bring that in. It would maybe help strengthen community trust, because there's definitely like a lack of trust towards the profession that exists in the Yukon and in all of Canada, I would say. So this was a brainstorming part. Like, we really want to continue this project and do, like Beckie said, like more engagement. Right now, this is like an idea that we had and we put it down, but we think that some of the potential implications for this policy for Yukon First Nations and self-government is that it would take a lot of time, money, effort, and planning, and it's really possible that they wouldn't be interested in that at all, right? So, okay, the next part is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reflections that came through for us doing this project.
So the first one is, I like to say, when I was looking out the window, where I'm staying, is talking about the tip of the iceberg. We just really felt that we were just getting there in our project. We could feel the excitement of how much further that it could actually grow and how much bigger it could be. It was very exciting. So we just felt like we just kind of reached that tip. But we felt like there needed to be more direct engagement with the Yukon First Nations. So we were coming up with all these great ideas, all these pieces, but we felt like that piece necessarily was missing. And then we felt like we were really too focused on the community service organization, getting a product versus what we were hoping for. The second one was limits to the lens that we used. So we used Morissette's lens because I think we found there wasn't necessarily a lot of guides, and also we used the one that we found most readily available that's fit the most in terms of the Yukon, and it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all, and that's because in the Yukon they're fairly unique. There's 14 First Nations, as I had mentioned early in the presentation, so this necessarily a one size is not going to work.
So I think it's like speaking to what you talked about in the beginning, like these projects really help to foster confidence in our own education process. And I think with just critical engagement, this project really helped us interact with political theories and concept at a macro level, like just in a concrete way, and to really think about what truly informs our profession and how do I feel about that, because I'm 2/3 of the way through my degree, and aligning with things is very important to me, and I think advocating for how things are governed is something that we should all really pay a lot of attention to. was really cool that our presentation kind of started up the regulation debate again with the association, because I think sometimes the Yukon tends to just copy paste what other provinces and territories have done, and it's like, wait a minute, we have a unique context. Should we really do this? What are the pros and cons? Maybe we should wait a little bit and think about this in more depth. So it built our confidence in expressing our own views, I think, on a debated and divided issues in ways that address its complexity, because I think regulation, it's almost like vaccinations. Like, are you for it or are you not, you know? So I think it's really more complex, and it's really worthy to look into it a little bit more before really claiming one side or the other. We got to do interviews with informants, and that was really cool in terms of just building kind of outreach skills and learning from others, and it kind of helps to find your own voice and your own path within the profession. And it gave us, like I said before, the concrete opportunity to think in like anti-oppressive, anti-racist ways at the macro level. And we gained a lot from working as a team. Like I said, I'm really grateful I got to be with Beckie. We worked really well together. We did go through a few hiccups, but we were able to express ourselves and learn from them with open discussion and communication, which I think is a really important skill. Be able to work well, not just with the people you serve, but with the people you work with. And I feel that we were both able to bring our personal and work experiences to the table, and I think we both valued coming to studying a little bit later in our lives. We really thought it brought a lot in terms of studying social work and being able to think critically about what we were doing. Questions? Yeah.
You guys looked much at how the new federal act of the Act Protecting First Nations Children and Youth is going to affect social work practice, especially in child protection in the Yukon, because I know the act just came into effect in January, and I work in Indigenous child welfare, and for us, we were already doing most of the things, but we're also regulated by the Nova Scotia Association of Social Workers, but also by the Mi'kmaq Maliseet Association of Social Workers in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So it's regulated on both sides. So we were doing most of those things, but without being regulated, that new act might impact how some of the regulations that social workers would have to answer to, not only provincially, but federally.
Well, because the Yukon's really unique, like I said, because of all of self-governing First Nations, there's actually lots shifting right now, and like we mentioned before, 11 of the 14 First Nations are able to draw down any legislation, and it's kind of something that's really on the table right now being talked of, because they could literally just decide to do their own thing, to do their own child welfare. So there's a new trilateral table where they're before it used to be the Yukon government and the territorial government that met and talked about child welfare issues, and now they're having can you hear me or?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, you're recording me. So now they have CYFN, which, remember the picture that you saw when you said the Yukon Native Brotherhood? It's now we have CYFN, the Council of Yukon First Nations, so they're at the table kind of representing all First Nations, and there is a lots of changes happening and accountability things happening in child welfare. So it's a pretty interesting time to enter this profession and just to be alive in the world, I think. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
I think my question is in connection with what you just posed, and maybe you can add a little to that. I was interested in actually hearing you talk about what pertains to the current system. So you have described it as unregulated, right? And so you are reviewing, regulations elsewhere and trying to find out how, you can. So what happens? What is going on within the unregulated, system currently? And did you find anything in the regulations you review that can speak to what is currently on the ground? And maybe you have to talk to various aspects of social work, in the Yukon, child protection and other, aspects of social work, and what are the enriching norms, governing current practice?
What are the enriching norms? I feel like we learned a lot from, I don't know how I can answer exactly your question, but when looking at like regulation in other places, I think we just started to wonder about how exactly it was going to make a difference. Like right now, we realize that, like I said, anybody can call themselves a social worker in the Yukon. I still think there's lots of mechanisms that make sure that, like, the Yukon government hires a lot of people in the Yukon, a lot of social workers, and they have kind of some accountability frameworks that make sure that people, if anybody feels harmed, they can go through that. In terms of NGOs, because it's a smaller community, I think people sometimes maybe feel comfortable going to speak directly to that place. I think the thing that was a little bit more concerning for us was like people in private practice. So if you're going to see a counselor, a social work practitioner that's doing counseling that is not regulated, it can kind of make it more difficult, yeah? So I think in order to weigh the different aspects, at this point, like we're not quite sure what would be the best option, right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but.
Okay, I think in an unregulated system,
yeah,
what people may call malpractice can be very, important. Maybe somebody engages in malpractice, but there's no, regulation asking you, telling you how to handle, the situation. That's what you may be afraid of. But do you have accountability mechanisms to hold anybody that engages in malpractice accountable, responsible for their behavior?
Apart from,
You mean currently?
Yes.
Well,
apart from the Yukon government, I don't know, the accountability framework they have. Yeah.
So, in any workplace, if we're speaking, like, I'll use Yukon government, probably the highest place that hires social workers. The only mechanism is actually through a discipline kind of regime through the employer. Other than that, that's probably the same with nonprofit agencies. So there is no mechanism at this current time necessarily in that avenue. There is accountability if it does go to a charge or CMP, but other than that, no, there isn't necessarily a way to move through that yet.
And is there any umbrella, around across the country, if there is a case of, child abuse, child neglect, whatever it may be, there's first of all investigation. In the case, you have to investigate, substantiate, and then other things can follow. Is there anything like that in place across the Yukon?
I think that when you're having, say, a particular First Nation in your community and you're having issues, there's a mechanism through their protocols as well that they can follow through. So there is that avenue as well. That's more of, I think, a political push and necessarily not an investigation per se. Yeah, I don't know if we've built that relationship yet enough at this point.
I think the reason I'm pushing
Yes, please go.
that maybe there's a form of regulation, but your emphasis is that social workers are not required to be registered.
Exactly.
Right? There's nothing requiring them to register before they practice. I think that's the key thing. But maybe there are mechanisms of holding people who hold themselves out as social workers accountable on the job.
Do you mind if I?
Thanks.
Because I'm
Yes.
also
break afterwards.
I'm also a member of the Association of Social Workers in Northern Canada.
Yeah.
So there's like a 15-year history of flip-flopping on regulation. A lot of social workers come to the Yukon, they're new, and they want to know, like, where do I register, where do I register, where do I register?
Yeah.
Because aren't I supposed to register? Isn't that what social workers do? Isn't that the sort of, professional thing that makes me legit, right? And so they come to the Yukon and there's no regulatory regime, oh my God, who's controlling this profession? Oh, what are all these social workers they're doing? I need to prove that I'm legit.
Yeah.
And there's a fear that I hear from the community, well, anyone can call themselves a social worker. We have no data on whether that even actually happens, but it's this sort of panic about this unregulated profession. And so the association gets a lot of push from our membership to say, we want you to look into regulation, we want you to look into whether or not, how we can regulate this profession, control these unlicensed practitioners. And so every 5 years or so, the association goes off, looks at policy options for regulation, and comes back kind of shrugging their shoulders. Like, if we let the Yukon territorial government control this, then it's going to turn into a situation like the Northwest Territories where it's essentially just the Department of Health and Social Services that's regulating the profession. Why not just let their own accountability mechanisms do that? They were doing that anyway. And so, okay, are we going to have the Association of Social Workers in Northern Canada? Are they going to be the regulatory body? Well, we only have 200 members across Northern Canada. We're a very tiny association. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to do that. I mean, that's maybe a hope. And so we just kind of keep falling back to this default of status quo. There hasn't been anything that has happened that really that's screaming, we need to regulate now, other than people saying, why aren't we regulated? And so when Bianca and Beckie embarked on this journey, I wasn't interested. I honestly was not interested in regulation either, but it was just something that we decided to do. Both of them were very adamant, can a policy option be just leave things as they are? Leave these unwritten norms in the way that things, they're not, the way, the norms, regulatory norms that we already have aren't necessarily perfect, but will implementing a formalized, institutionalized regulatory regime, will that change anything? And so you both said to me multiple times, I don't even know if regulation is a good idea. And my argument was, you need to make sure that that's a policy option of doing nothing. You need to tell the association that doing nothing is a totally legitimate policy option, because why do something if there's already something there, just because it doesn't have that, if there's no Social Workers Act. That's going to be complicated because the Yukon government now, all of a sudden, it's a part of the 10-year cycle, now we want regulation. The Liberals are in, so they want regulation. We just regulated midwives, right? And so then we've got social workers jumping on the regulation bandwagon. And so it just cycles and cycles. With respect to norms around regulation, I think a lot exists. That'd be a really interesting study to look at what norms already exist that protect the public and regulate social workers' behavior. I think they do exist, and I think in a small community it's impossible for some form of social regulation not to exist, right? Where you see clients avoiding workers because they know that there's cultural harm being done to clients from those workers. So there's people that people naturally gravitate towards and people who naturally gravitate away from. And reputations rise and fall depending on how clients understand and see you. So that's one of those norms that I think would come out of that. Anyways, I'm sorry. You guys are so great. I just had some things that kind of bolted into my brain.
Thank you.
Yeah.